Well, welcome everybody to a lunchtime session here. My name is Charlie O'Donnell. I am a partner at Brooklyn Bridge Ventures. We are going to be talking about information security for startups and growing companies. And I've got a really fantastic panel of folks who know way more about this than I do. So I'll apologize in advance for the remedial questions. But just to give you a quick 2 minutes on, or 30 seconds on Brooklyn Bridge invests in seed and pre-seed stage companies in and around the New York City area across a wide variety of different types of startups. So anything from B2B, consumer, even in the security space. And part of the reason why I thought this panel would be a good topic is because it's something that, truth be told, as an investor, I feel like I can diagnose a bunch of functions of a company and feel like, hey, we should lean into marketing a little more, or, sales doesn't feel like it's completely covered. But I don't feel that way about the information security side. And things come up over time. Companies needing to go through various hurdles of compliance and stuff like that, and I don't feel as informed as I should be. And so, like what I recommend to the startups I back, I just went about and found a bunch of smarter people than me on the topic, and decided to ask them about what to do. So I'm going to go in clockwise order of how I have everybody on my screen, and so I'll just ask everybody to just give their quick introduction, and then we'll get started. So Jam.
Hi, folks. I am Jam Leomi. I'm the lead security engineer at Honeycomb, also known through websites as honeycomb.io. Yeah, I've been working in the tech industry for, I think, nearly 20 years at this point, and about 10 years in the startup space.
Jam, I recommend not doing that math if you want to feel like I've been doing that kind of. How long have I been a VC? And the number as it gets bigger never makes me feel better. So
yeah, it doesn't.
Grace, welcome.
Hello, my name is Grace Ward. I am a security architect for Two Sigma Investments. I've been in the industry for a while. And I would say that, at least for the purposes of this conversation, I'm coming to it both from the practicing of security, but also as a customer of startups that have been trying to sell products to us. And of course, we care about it.
Cool. And Tyler.
Hey everyone, Tyler Healy, VP and Head of Security at cloud service provider DigitalOcean. I'm also a advisor for startups, currently advising for WasteScript, which is a developer experience startup. They are, I think, under 20 people. And so when I joined DO, it was actually a little past startup stage, I'd say. It was about 4 or 5 years ago. We were about 250 people. But I keep myself fresh in the startup space with the advisory roles.
Gotcha. Cool. So, and just so everybody knows, we will be sharing the recording after. So if anybody misses anything or wants to go back to it, we will make that available. So keep that in mind, panelists, as well. So just to kind of kick things off definitionally, when I think of information security, my mind just immediately goes to like hacks and firewalls, but I know there's a lot more to it and a lot more going on. So Tyler, can you just contribute like one function as you think of the many aspects of information security that is a piece of this that maybe people aren't always thinking about?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes to mind for me right away is privacy and customer data handling and how you're handling customer information. Sometimes that lives in larger organizations with a GC, in legal, but oftentimes the core aspects of privacy engineering Things like, how are we transferring data between third-party systems? How are we completing customer data deletion requests? How are we making sure that we're not over collecting information about our customers and using it in a way that might not be appropriate, maybe from a marketing or sales standpoint? There's so many questions to be answered about, especially dependent on the kind of business that you're building and what you're planning to do with customer data as a part of your business model. So many things to be answered about how those things can be solved. And some of that leans towards the technology side of things around data protection itself, but also just more the business logic behind the business itself and what you want to do with customer information. So that's a space that I've found it's interesting how often, even outside of the engineering parts of the organization, having conversations with marketing or sales or finance about where all the information is that we may be collecting as a business and where it goes. So certainly there's the what happens if it gets hacked aspect of that, as you were mentioning, Charlie, but all of the things that before an incident even occurs, how you're mitigating an impact of a potential incident is something that I think is super interesting from the privacy engineering standpoint.
Cool. Grace?
A big part of what I do and a big part of what I've had to do for a long time is making sure that we are able to answer the questions of our customers and the questions of regulatory agencies that our security practices are up to their requirements. And in many cases, this work is both the implementation of systems of control and detection and so forth. So trying to address the hacker case or the insider case or whatnot. But in many cases, it's also the business of being able to do an inventory of your environment and to be able to prove to a regulator or an auditor that you've actually implemented effective means of complying with their requirements. And these depend on the kind of industry that you're in. So it's going to depend a lot on what the startup's focus is, the kind of data they're handling, what the customers care about. It's not a very sexy side of information security, but compliance generally is a big part of it. And unfortunately, in some cases, it can be overwhelming. So I think that's a major component.
It can be if answering that compliance document accurately and completely means driving revenue. So I don't, like if it gets in the way, it's certainly not so sexy. But I personally find well-functioning, efficiently running startups to be sexy as far as I'm concerned. Jem, what else would you add to this list?
Man, they covered both of the things that I would have covered. I think the one thing that doesn't get talked about a whole lot, but I see a trend growing, is more of the focus on application security. And like you talk about the privacy and the data handling, but there's more stuff in terms of monitoring and observing how attacks happen. And like really focusing on the basics of information security, because as we've seen from recent news of people getting hacked, most people are getting hacked on the basics stuff, right? Like having access control policies, or making sure that their secrets are stored properly, or what else? Or making sure that their supply chain is secure and the way that they're integrating the services, like, if there is an incident that happens, they can quickly shut it down, or, figure out how to mitigate risk. So like, I think the other thing that people need to realize with information security is like, you don't have to go in at a full clip thinking that you have to fix any and all of the things. Sometimes the biggest thing is just focusing on, when you're going into information security, especially as a small company, is just the basics. Like one of the things that consistently gets focused on with a whole lot of questionnaires that I see even in compliance when it comes to application security, is focusing on the OWASP top 10. It's like, do you address it? I've seen it on a couple questionnaires. And so even that is pretty basic, right? And it's easily accessible in terms of standards. So I think that would be the other thing is like before going into the compliance or the privacy data, it's like, what are the basics that we're focusing on in order to be secure?
You know, you mentioned some access control, and I can't tell you, even before something begins to look like a company, I can't tell you how many startups I know that have fumbled the access control thing super early in the life of a company, and it comes to a head when an employee gets let go under not the greatest of circumstances. And then it turns out that like, oh, that's the employee that bought our domain, or has access to that account, or that one reset is going to their phone or whatever, and you have sort of a bad experience. So early on in a startup's life, you do a lot of things in sort of a duct tape together way. And this is the one thing that I would say I've seen a number of times come back to bite you later. It's like, wait, why can't we get into our stuff? Oh, that co-founder that we fired 18 months ago is the only person who can, reset that password or whatever, and just it was forgotten about. And so, I want to double click on the access control thing. So as companies, oftentimes, as Grace, you mentioned, customers submit questionnaires, maybe have some requirements. And so there are these frameworks out there that they want to see you adhere to. And Grace, I'll pose this to you. Do you think that just following certain frameworks is kind of enough of a guidepost of what I should be doing as a newish growing startup? If I check the boxes of things that my customers asked me to adhere to, is that good? Because I think some people in the audience might not understand what does actually being good look like, and these frameworks are kind of all they have, or at least all that's coming to them to say, oh yeah, we checked that box. What else do we need to do? So, are they enough?
They're a good start. And in fact, we care a great deal about the SOC 2 compliance of many of the vendors that we do business with. It's probably one of the most annoying things to get through for both the vendor and for us. And we're one of those annoying companies that sends the really long questionnaires about what you're doing for your access controls. But it's a good start. And if you actually achieve SOC 2 compliance, if that's your business, if you're hosting customer data, if you're a service provider in the cloud, then you've probably done a lot of the right things. And it's a good positioning. Now, the thing about such frameworks is that they, in some cases, they're relatively general about the kinds of things, the technologies that you're supposed to implement, the kinds of flows and policies and systems of control. And so the world moves much faster than these policies. The world moves much faster generally. The kinds of threats you face change all the time. There's things that we just haven't figured. Things you haven't imagined yet, or they're just, it's always a churn, there's trends. And so it's a good start. But naturally, in your own self-interest as a startup, as an investor in a startup, as someone who has skin in the game, it's not ever enough. And I don't think anything is ever enough. It's a moving target.
And these types of frameworks, they're kind of a point in time thing, right? You achieve some certification, but it's also not continuous, right? I mean, you could sort of let some of these things lag.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, these are point in time snapshots when things are being evaluated, when you're testing to whether or not you have complied with a given directive from it. And so, of course, organizations may slip a bit, but that's a risk anyone has. I mean, entropy is a thing in complex systems. And even as a customer, if you've been doing business with a vendor that's SOC 2 compliant, you have to take into account that, there might be some slippage.
Okay. So Jam, I'll turn it over to you. What are the types of things that your team does to sort of answer this question of like, are we good? Are we covered? In addition to trying to comply with some of these frameworks, like what are your kind of internal checks and things that you kind of pay attention to? What do those things kind of look like?
Well, I think one of the things I like about my current company is that I work with a bunch of very security conscious and aware people. So though we have regular checks that we do throughout the year, I'm not going to say the occurrence, but I will say, like, on top of those checks, we have a very aware security team such that when things happen, we're alerted to it very, very quickly. As well as, we have engineers that take it upon themselves to be abreast of vulnerabilities that happen and occur, or 0 days that drop. Like, in addition to the bug bounty program that we do have. So the things that kind of help us with the day-to-day to say, are we good? Like, on top of the internal checks that we have, the automated monitoring that we have, is just a community of people within the company who do care about security. Like, security is a company value here, which I appreciate.
And actually, you mentioned something. I don't want to gloss over it.
Yeah.
Bug bounty program.
Yes.
I'm curious about like what that is and how you found that helpful.
So basically a bug bounty or vulnerability disclosure program is basically where you have external parties report on bugs within your infrastructure within a specific scope. Scoping is really, really important with a bug bounty program. And based off of the level of vulnerability and the impact it has, they are rewarded or given a bounty. There's many different discussions about the validity of bug bounty programs. But I'd say for startups, it's really dependent on what your security posture is before you implement one. Like, I feel that Honeycomb is at a big enough level where I see the value of it with us and how it continues to have value. But I've been at other startups where it's just like, no, it doesn't make sense. Or we have other controls in place where it's not necessary. So like, in general, I would say before rolling something out, like the most important thing before rolling out a bug bounty program is check your security posture first, because otherwise you're just going to get a whole lot of really poor signal that you already know about.
Gotcha. Cool.
So like, that's the one thing I'd want people to keep in mind, because like the other thing is you don't want to get into a situation where, because I have been in situations in the past where I've ran bug bounty programs that I'd eventually have to stop because it's just like, this is not giving us good enough signal. And also you don't want to burn out the security people that you have,
Cool. So Tyler, you mentioned you were advising a company, and maybe I could sort of shift the conversation to sort of starting. And, the point at which a company says, hey, this is something we need to get a little more serious about. And sometimes that often happens when they have to answer a questionnaire. But I'd be curious, like, in terms of building the function, right? Is it the kind of thing where it's somebody's job to answer the questionnaire and that person inevitably becomes the de facto security person? Or do you outsource it? Like, I know there are like virtual CISOs. So what do you recommend as sort of the initial starting point of how to resource it?
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna depend on the shape of the company itself. If you have, I think as Jan was describing, a bunch of security conscious engineers who are already on staff who understand the concepts and aren't going to be put off by like FIDO hardware tokens for authentication and some more advanced access control regimens. I mean, that's kind of like the best case scenario where you can get to, probably 25, 30, maybe even 50 employees before actually getting a dedicated security person on staff to really run and start to build the program. That's a great starting point.
And actually, to that point, it's probably something that if your founder is not technical, is not something that people often think of during an interview process of, they want somebody who can build the app and help it grow and all of this sort of stuff. But it's one of the first times I've heard just the hiring security conscious engineers is sort of like, yeah, duh, like that would be that would go a long way.
Yeah, it certainly does. It's a good starting point, and it just depends on what kind of business you're building, right? If it's really a cloud native, tech native business that just you can use a cloud provider and then there are actually a fair amount of service providers now that do like overlay on top of your cloud, so cloud security posture management. And they help you get a SOC 2 or some other compliance scheme that you're looking for without having to dedicate a whole lot towards it. That's usually the best starting point. It's really keep the stack simple, integrate with the cloud environment that you're using. Like you said, get early on the access management train, single sign-on, be able to enforce roles and groups and authentication mechanisms super early on. That can buy you some more time before you have to go down the path of really, I think your initial security hire or person should be more attuned to the product environment that you're building than just say doing the basics of access management and achieving a compliance certification. You should hopefully be able to back into the client compliance certification rather than using that as the reason why you're having to go get someone to do security. Hopefully the practices that you build from the outset allow you to get that without really the hire being just someone who's answering questionnaires. Because frankly, if you're hiring someone to answer security questionnaires or calls from customers, you're probably underutilizing that person's skill sets as a security expert within the org.
Gotcha. Grace, I see a lot of head nodding on your part, and I'd just be curious as to on the hiring of someone who might be your first dedicated resource. What are the types of things that you would look for in terms of how to vet somebody's sort of security mindset?
Well, I really agree with what Tyler had to say about sort of trying to take advantage of what your providers can offer and to look at some outside partners who can help or services that sort of take care of a lot of this groundwork for you. And so when we think about hire, in many cases, what you would be looking for your first security hire is someone who has relatively broad knowledge in that space, in the space of information security, from the compliance side all the way up to application security and some of the esoteric things about software supply chains and so forth. But you need someone who knows enough of the different domains or knows about their existence to know what to start doing, where to start pulling in outside resources, or to be able to assess your security, like your security maturity. And then you can sort of know what investment areas there are. So I would say that the key idea is looking for a relatively general kind of practitioner. And they need to have some skin in the game because it's important to look under every rug and to be able to piss off a few people because you may affect their workloads or their goals. So that's a big part of it. It's mostly, I would say, someone who's got a divergent thinking talent. They can kind of see across things and then kind of converge into an actionable plan. And someone who can speak well to product, as Tyler said, and someone who can communicate to the founders in a way that is compassionate and aware of what the startup needs in order to actually make revenue and actually get somewhere. Because the other side of this is that you can certainly hire people who just kind of they almost have a little bit of a thrill out of finding things that have to be fixed, or things that, you know, stop everything, we have to do this. And if you don't have that little bit of a street smart about making money and about markets and about priorities, they may not be as effective as they need to be.
Well, I think to that end, what you're essentially referring to is like business risk, right? And balancing off like that there are there's never going to be sort of complete invulnerability,
right?
But the company has to be able to function. And I know, you know, to some extent, it's a little bit like working with legal teams, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, the best lawyer in the world is not the one that says no to everything, because then you wouldn't be able to run the company. So
exactly.
I mean, that would absolutely keep you out
And
of
it's
jail.
close to home too. Yeah. All right.
That would keep you out of jail, but it wouldn't enable your equity to be worth anything. So, Jam, I wanted to touch on something that you said about sort of keeping abreast of what's going on in vulnerabilities. It feels like it'd be a little bit overwhelming to just like stay on top of all of, you know, the vulnerabilities that pop up, things going on in your environment. And so I'd be curious, like your team and you as an information security professional, I mean, do you just subscribe to like everything? Like how do you stay on top of all of these types of things?
I don't subscribe to everything. I think one of the good things Grace brings up about being a security professional is like when to reach out for tools. Like some of the tools are very, very helpful to, you know, scan for vulnerabilities to make that faster. The other ways, and this comes up with compliance too, is like what resources are you using, like forums or like these days social media. So sometimes I feel like this is the only reason I keep my Twitter account at this point, is to be like, if something, you know, pops off with a specific vendor or a 0-day pops up, I immediately know that information, and I'm able to like easily grab it. 1 second, sorry.
No worries. Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry. But those are some of the ways. I think the only thing that I am subscribed to right now is the US CERT alerts, because those are useful too. And they also give a valid signal to some of the stuff I see on social media, to be like, yes, this is actually a serious thing, to kind of validate the signal. And then, like I said, the last thing is like, us having a culture at Honeycomb of people being able to freely bring up issues as they come along, also helps with certain vulnerabilities and stuff that may fall through the cracks between all of the things that we have. But like having those makes it such that like being abreast of the vulnerabilities is not the big issue. I think the bigger thing that startups need to focus on is like when you get those vulnerabilities or when you add that tool, like what are the processes of triaging them and managing the risk for those? Because I think a whole lot of people don't think about that. And when they don't, and you're like, hey, this is a critical vulnerability, when really in the context of your business, it's kind of not. Or you're like, hey, here's a list of all these vulnerabilities, go fix them. That's not a good thing to say to your engineering team. You need to have more of a conversation of like, okay, we just had this tool. How are we going to manage this so that like, such that like, this is a manageable thing moving forward. So
as this function within your company starts to mature and level up, I guess you could sort of say you could add people, you could add processes, and you could add tech. And I'm wondering if you have any opinions, and Tyler, I'll start with you on, is there a preference to do any one of those things, right? Like, do good processes mean you don't need as much tech, or does the right tech enable you to be light on people? And then is there anything that people like in those three categories over or underspend on, in your opinion, as this function starts to scale up?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, the answer is probably some dance of all three at various times. I think it would be a mistake, just to kind of go the reverse direction here, mistake to just overinvest in tech. To the points that Jan was making about, if you buy a vulnerability scanner, a WAF, and instead of just using what might be available for some of the basics, like we talked about before with the providers that you might already have, you would be paying a ton for software for a bunch of noisy things that are just going to frustrate people, and not actually add value to the business. So I think investing in people first, generalists first, to cover some specific areas where you might start with the basics around product security, infrastructure security, the things that you need to use day to day, and someone who can be attuned to the business needs, like Grace was saying, the revenue drivers for a startup almost always need to be more important than just fixing the thing that might have popped up on the security side, unless it's really dire and exploitable for the business itself. So a few people who can navigate that space, start to get some processes in place where there may have been bad habits before. So for example, when I joined DigitalOcean 4 years ago, there was a program called the 50/50 program, where, as it is with a lot of scrappy startups, people were bringing their own devices to work. I mean, it was actually a sponsored program where it was like DO would buy a endpoint for someone and split the cost, really. And the employee would then actually own that computer and could continue to use it going forward. Created a lot of interesting challenges around, can we deploy endpoint protection software to someone's now personally owned device? Legally, no, they own it. The company doesn't own it. We can't deploy the right level of monitoring and endpoint protection that we would want to on that device. And so there are going to be a lot of scrappy moves that a startup will have made early on by the time you start looking at hiring a security team. And I think getting the right team in place who can untangle that a little bit with process and then apply the right technologies is probably the right move, because there was no sense in over extending ourselves into the endpoint security and EDR and monitoring space before we'd figured out how to actually get that on and get that onto the devices for employees. And it may sound simple to just like swap things out, but people have been using their computers for a long time. That's a change management process. So I think getting folks in the door can think about change management, think about the pieces that need to be unraveled or built upon, and then apply the right technology. So I think my answer is probably people, process, and then technology, or some combination of the three as you work through the challenges there.
Gotcha. Grace, do you have any thoughts on that question?
I think we do spend a lot of time buying tools that we don't have time to actually implement fully. The vulnerability thing that Jan brought up earlier was something that I've certainly dealt with a lot too. You buy these things and then because they are a deliverable for that year, or in my case, because there's something that's kind of in front of me, they could take over and you kind of lose sight of everything else. So I think the idea of people first, thinking about these problems and prioritizing these problems in a business context makes sense. Processes do help to maintain consistency. And there's going to be a lot of, particularly in startups, there's going to be a lot of decisions that were made on the fly or just weren't really well considered that do not fit into a more mature model, whether it's the ability to deploy endpoint protection or even the tools of choice that someone may have.
Cool.
Yeah.
So Oh, one other thing I wanted to ask, and Jam, I'll send this your way. What are the things that your company and your coworkers and the folks on the supervisory and leadership level can do to make your life easier as an information security professional at the company, so that, you know, it doesn't feel like the company's whole security and safety just relies on you doing your job?
I think the big thing, and I'm going to separate my company out of this
Okay,
response.
just generally.
I think in general, though, being at companies that understand security has to be a part of the culture makes my job very much easier. And this has to also be from the top. Like, you just can't shoehorn security in and then it be like an afterthought. Like, it has to be a thought that is not at the end, or like being like, you know, oh, security is here, we have security, but then not use it, or then not like go after the things. And like, in certain ways, I've been at companies where like security is cared about, but it's only cared about one part of the company and not at the top. So I'd say that would be the biggest thing, is like having that culture of security, and like bringing, again, Honeycomb into this, like having that culture of security and people caring about security and being concerned, like actually does make my job easier, because I don't feel like I am in a silo or I am isolated. That being said, to follow up with the answer of when you're growing, I think the thing that startups should keep in mind is that whether you definitely are going to need people at some point, but like what part of the people you're going to need is going to be dependent on where you are as a business and what the business is focusing on. Like, you know, I've been at some companies where there's been more of an application security lean that is needed. I've been at companies where the company is growing and there's more of a compliance need. So like, it's to keep in mind, like when you're hiring people, like, yes, a generalist works out, but then you need to think about working with that generalist and being like, who do we need next? Like, what are your pain points right now? But yeah, those are the things. Yeah.
I was just going to echo that too, just to kind of add on to the back of what I talked about earlier. Really does depend on the market that you're in, as Jan was just saying. Like, if you are developing health tech, understanding what it takes to get through trials and FDA processes and GXP practices for developing pharma or whatever it may be, that's going to play a major role in how you think about hiring a security team. So if you're kind of a health tech startup, defining that market space is super important. So yeah, I agree. I mean, there may be flavors on what you want to get and how you want to invest that really are market dependent.
Yep.
So I want to make sure that if anybody in the audience has a question, they raise their hand using the Zoom feature and get it out there. I have a few more questions, and then I'm happy to take audience Q&A. So if you guys are thinking of something to keep in mind, you know, use that feature, and I'll come to you after I hit up these next two questions. What are good resources and communities that you would recommend for folks who have just started to take on the information security role at their company? Is there any group or publication or a newsletter, anything along those lines that you guys have found helpful? Tyler, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm trying to think back to it's I gotta be honest, it's a little difficult for me to answer that coming from I've been in security for a long time, worked at large organizations for the most part, from a security standpoint, and just the ecosystem of information that is built around that. Thinking for someone who just isn't even a security practitioner, keeping a pulse on what is in the world today. Definitely a few publications out there.
Or even just what you're using now is totally fine to like.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes down to some of the actual service providers that we use that actually provide feeds for it. Even the CISA feeds are great. They've done a good job of curating what's actually exploitable in the wild, and it just kind of depends on what sort of information you're looking for. If you're looking for what are those vulnerabilities that we should actually care about, the CISA feeds are great, especially because they've done some lens on it about what's actually being exploited temporarily versus just a bunch of noise about vulnerabilities. But even things like Krebs on security, and Krebs is great from a journalistic standpoint of highlighting what are the latest things that an attacker is thinking about. So what are the schemes that are popping up? Because it's not even just about traditional InfoSec. Krebs does a good job of highlighting what are like the schemes that attackers are bringing to the marketplace, not just how defenders are thinking about the next steps for their businesses. So those are a couple that I usually keep a pulse on. And even I know it's confusing because there's Hacker News, but there's also something called The Hacker News, which is just an aggregation of more of the InfoSec side of the world, not just the startup side of the world. But yeah, it's a different service, but I kind of keep that tuned in on my Google newsfeed.
Anybody else have resources or groups that they find particularly helpful?
I was going to echo something. Sorry, I was going to echo something Jam said earlier about Twitter. That I find following Twitter is a good way. Following individuals on Twitter, including Krebs, gets you connected to a lot of other people who have things to say, and eventually you kind of find your sweet spot there. In terms of if you're in the New York area, there's a couple of groups that I think are nice. NYSEC is a nice NYSEC is a nice meetup that gets you to hang out in a casual setting with folks, gives you an idea of what people think about and how they are. And there's Empire Hacking, which is currently virtual, I think, which does formal presentations. That's a nice place to go. And then there's another website I would recommend called Bleeping Computer. That's pretty well done. If you just kind of want a single source on which to launch out and look at other things. So those tend to be where I keep my eyes, just to keep a pulse on things.
Cool. So we got a question from the audience. Zach is going through a SOC 2 type 1 audit in the next couple of months. And he wants to know, where's he likely to slip? Like what gets overlooked going into that audit that maybe should be taking a look at it? I certainly don't have an answer, so. Does it sort of, really depend on the company or?
Yeah, we've talked about it a few times, and Charlie, you brought it up at the beginning. It's just access management and access control. That's where auditors really like to focus. And actually the second one is the one that I think Sunil brought up above that in the questions around change management. For some reason, that's a place that auditors love to look because they're looking for documented process around, you say you do one thing, but actually prove it to me. So if I were to guess, those are two areas. But then the third one is just having the policies and processes actually documented that you want the auditors to review. As frustrating as it sounds and can be, because it's not always real security, auditors really do dig into your paperwork. Let's say if you are prescribing a particular approach to authentication and authorization, you may actually have it correctly done from a technical standpoint, but if it's not backed up by the policy or the process, they might ding you for it. Well,
one question I have as where people are working is changing. I have companies now that are thinking about getting, let's just say maybe not getting back to their own office, but, coming together as a group. And I think there's going to be, a lot of hybrid environments, some work from home, some, people coming, kind of in and out of the office at different times. And one area that I'd be curious about is actually just physical security and, the actual workplace environment and who's supposed to be there when, and whether you're, you may have let your previous lease expire and now you're jumping into a co-working space and all of that. Are there any things that starters should be thinking about when they are less in control of the spaces that they're working at? When a virtual team comes together for a retreat somewhere, the types of things that people are sort of all mixing up right now and working in co-working spaces.
I think the big thing that people need to keep in mind is when you're in uncontrollable situations, control the things you do have control over. The key thing that has changed within the past 10 years, I'd say, is that we've adopted more cloud security operations, such that we can do a whole lot more things in the cloud. So like when thinking about, with keeping those things in mind, the biggest thing you want to think about in terms of control when being in those environments is how endpoints are accessing and storing customer data. Because that's where it becomes important about, okay, if we're going to be in those situations, what controls do we have in place such that when we have these shifts and changes, they don't impact our compliance or our risk.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, listen, I really, really appreciate all of your time today. Super thoughtful, and this is giving me a lot to think about and incredibly helpful. So is there any things that you guys want to point out in terms of your own findability? I know some of you mentioned that you're using Twitter for finding resources, but I don't know how much you guys want to promote something, a newsletter, a Medium page, or if you want to take a pass on it, that's fine too. Anybody want to toss anything out?
Pretty much my handle is jamfish728. So if you want to reach out to me on there, otherwise it's just a lot of, for lack of a better word, shit posting for me. But that is one way that you can reach out to me. I check Twitter more than I do LinkedIn. So if you want to reach out there, feel free to do so. Otherwise, tech@jam.fish is another way for people who have any follow-up questions.
Nice. And not that I provided any useful information on the panel, but I am CEO NYC on most of the things. That's actually my initials. It's not like a corporate thing. So
Just convenient, huh?
yeah, it just happens.
Very convenient.
Yeah.
Although I do have this debate with my brother who uses both the capital O and the capital D as part of his initials, which is like not how I think of. To me, initials is the first letter, but if you had CEO, why would you make it COD? That's terrible.
Yeah.
So
I think you've made the right choice.
Yeah, I think so too.
I'm not on Twitter at all, actually. I do sometimes tune in, but I try not. I have no account on Twitter. But you can find me on LinkedIn. I try to keep up with in between all of the many sales reach outs that happen where people have security tools that they're trying to sell people, which is the security software market is insanely saturated at this point, and they're just hitting up everyone up on LinkedIn. But please feel free to DM me if you have any follow-ups.
Actually, I do have a question about that. Grace mentioned it too. If I was a security startup and thinking that one of you might be my customer, any tips on breaking through or just best practices? I mean, clearly you bought something in the last year, and if you could sort of think about like, oh, like this sales approach was super helpful, or their reach out approach was sort of interesting. I'd love to hear your take on that. Grace, any tips for?
I have feelings about this.
Yeah, share your feelings.
I get the security space is awful. They reach out to my personal addresses. They come I'm surprised they haven't shown up in my house yet. And it's really, really not okay. It's not okay. Not okay.
Particularly for security.
And then, yeah, well, just because I think as Tyler said, the market's so saturated now. It's really, and there's so many tools that are not commercial tools. There's a lot of really great tooling that's open source, and there's practices, there's a lot of things built in that most of the time security teams don't necessarily need to go out and buy anything. They're gonna pay for a service in the cloud that's included with GCP or AWS or whatever, or Azure. And so here's the thing that I would say that really annoys the hell out of me. I work for a company that has a relatively large security budget, and I'm trying to find a thing. I hear a product name mentioned. I go to the product page, and there's no technical details about what the product does. It's all like case studies, and it's all hidden because they want you to talk to somebody to find out what the product is. And this is for small companies that are starting up, and I need support documentation, tech support. Like, I need to be able to dig in and see how the product works, what authentication modes it supports. I need details before I even waste the time to have a conversation with someone, because in many cases you find out these products and they're just elaborate hacks of other things. So my advice, twofold. First, put it all out there. If there's some trade secret or secret sauce that you're trying to keep somebody else from walking off with, okay, be a little bit obscure about some things, but if I'm going to integrate this in my environment, I need to know how successful I'm likely to be. I need to know if it's going to support the authentication methods I care about. The second one is talk about your product on Twitter in detail. Talk about case studies. Like Haroon Mir and Thanks to Canary is like the best case study for how to market a product super well. The Canary tokens are amazing, and it's such a clever product, but I don't know if Haroon really markets it anywhere because it's just so popular because it's talked about. So get your product in front, just talk about it. Talk about case studies, talk about how people can use it, talk about stuff like that. And don't make me talk to someone directly, because it's a high barrier, and never, ever, ever reach out to me personally. That's just, it's not gonna work.
Yeah.
Very opinionated.
I'd kind of want to add to that, like, definitely do not reach out to me. I know everybody knows that there's a pattern to emails, but please don't use my personal nor work email, or in some cases, don't use, like, this wasn't me, but I know somebody else was contacted using their phone number. Right. Don't even know how the person got the phone number.
I've had that happen to me. Pitches on my cell phone.
Yeah, but like, don't do that if you're in sales. Like, that's going to, especially if the person is at a C-level, it's going to make them definitely not want to talk to you now nor in the future. But definitely echoing all that Grace said, having the information, having it be talked about, having people that talk about the product openly and how it functions and how it works. One thing I do appreciate about Honeycomb is that we give the opportunity for people to play with our product and see how easy to use it is. I know security can't do that because, like, obviously there's some things that have to be looped in for it to be valuable, but like, the ability and the openness to be transparent about your product, especially at a younger time, I think provides things to be really useful.
Cool.
Yeah, I would echo all of the things. I can't even answer my personal cell phone anymore. I just don't, even if it's, unless it's a number that's already in my contacts list, I will not answer it. Obviously there's all the robocall and stuff that's all over the place anyway, but the number of sales calls and actually text messages, surprisingly enough, that I get each week is insane. So yeah, definitely not that. The other thing that's kind of a, at least it used to be a trope, I definitely still see it in security products, is it basically says like, prevent the hackers, you'll stop the hackers with my product. You're basically fully secure. It's just the Barracuda network stuff that used to be at all the airports back in the day. Ring for that. It's just those product pitches don't work. You need to be specific about what problem you're solving, not just that you're stopping hackers from affecting a company. That's I think the only other thing I would add on top of the marketing and sales pitch side of things.
Gotcha. And on that note, it is 1 o'clock exactly.